Hello, I am Pastor Matthew Verhoeg from the Valley Alliance Church, and this is a commentary of Luke chapter 11, chapter 15, verses 11 to, well, let's see how far we go. It's 35, I think, 35, 32. And this is the passage commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son. And let's jump right into it. Before we'll get a little bit of context, if you're following along, we remember in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 to 10, the Pharisees grumble against Jesus because the tax collectors and sinners are coming to him. And Jesus now gives three parables about lost things. The first is the lost sheep, then it is the lost coin, and now we are going to get the parable of the lost son. And we're going to see the same themes except expanded out to such a expansive way. Now, in most parables, we should be careful about reading too much into particular details. However, this parable functions in much more of an allegory than most parables do, and so the individual pieces are worthy of going into more detail while still maintaining a certain level of care not to read too much into certain details, because Jesus' big picture here is going to be about, in the end, the older brother's refusal to come in, and along the way about God's expansive grace towards the repentant sinner. As we see back in verse 1 of the chapter, the tax collectors and sinners were coming to him. All right, let's jump in, verse 11. This is my translation, as always. And he said, "A certain man has two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that is coming to me.' And he divided to them the estate." Them will notice here, because he divided not only to his son, but he also divided to the older son. So the older son would have had rights of inheritance at this time as well. It has been, I've heard it said that this is kind of like asking for your father to be dead because you only got the inheritance after your death. But this isn't entirely true, because it was a common practice, and sometimes, to divide the estate before the death of the father, just like in farming communities still today. Like my dad divided a part of the farm so that we could take over as he went into he ended up going to mission work and other things. So he could be there to see the division before he passed on. The same way. So this isn't entirely strange, but it might not be the greatest idea. And Jewish law actually warns against fathers from dividing estates too early. The younger son would be entitled to 1/3 of the total property, and the older 2/3. And if there were more sons, it would be a little less, because so basically you got an equal share, except for the oldest son got a double portion. So the younger son took his small amount, and since he doesn't seem to be married here, we can assume he's probably in his late teens. So this is a case of teenage rebellion. And let's see what happens. After not many days, the younger son gathered. And in gathered here, we can, this is a word. He gathered all his things, and this refers to the act of selling the land or whatever property there was and converting it to coin, to cash, so he could carry it, and departing into a far country. And there he scattered his inheritance, living recklessly. And after spending all his wealth, there was a great famine across the country, and he began to be in need. All right, I'll just get a little space there so we can see. He presumably goes away so he no longer has to deal with the father. You can almost sense that he has a guilt already, but he's guided by his passions, which take him to a far country where he has a lot of coin in his pocket, and is the case with so many people. When they have money and things to spend, it gets spent. He scatters his inheritance. Most translations would have something like squander. It literally means scatter, and this is one of our words of the day. We'll look at this. Diascorpizo, which is to cause a group or gathering to disperse or scatter, with a possible emphasis on the distributive nature of scattering. That is to say, each going in a different direction. To scatter, to cause, to disperse. Diascorpizo. We see this in passages like Mark 14:27. I will strike the shepherd and the flock will be scattered. And here, this is a beautiful picture. And the literary just beauty of this passage cannot be overstated. In the far country, he scatters his inheritance. And so this thing which was once together and useful is now scattered into the wind in reckless living. Later we'll see the older son accuse him of consorting with prostitutes, and that's probably not too far the case. He drank and slept and partied his way to poverty, literally selling the family farm to fill his lusts. And there's a famine. And this great famine, you could almost see as a providential thing, that maybe the son has some plan. He's going to keep working enough to keep going, like, my one friend who used to just, snowboard and surf, and he'd just work enough to pay for his fun. And maybe he had a plan to do this, but there was a famine. And Calvin here talks about this, and he gets to, this is the Calvin quote of the day. Hunger proved to be the best teacher. Instructed by this example, let us not imagine that God deals cruelly with us, if at any time he visits us with heavy afflictions. For in this manner, those who are obstinate and intoxicated with mirth are taught by him to be obedient. In short, all the miseries which we endure are profitable if they, in turn, lead us to repentance. And so this famine proved to be part of what brought him to need. And then, as he was in need and going along, he hired himself. The word literally means he joined himself, and it probably in the sense of hiring himself to one of the citizens. I don't think there's a sexual connotation here, although that was my thought when I first read it. But he's hired himself as a day laborer, which is just working, doing whenever there's work to be done. If like in the parable where the master's going out to get workers for his vineyard, people just standing around, he says, hey, come and work. And he's like that. He's just standing around and he's waiting for someone to hire him. And he hired himself to one of the citizens of that country. And he sent him into his field to feed pigs. Now, as a Jewish person, being, associating with pigs is bad. And here he is as the lowest of the low, feeding pigs. And he longed to eat the carob pods, which the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So the carob pods here, and carob pods were used for fattening pigs, for like finishing them out like we would with corn grain now. Carob's actually used still today as a replacement for chocolate in health food. And the only reason I know this is my wife grew up in a home that ate such things. But in ancient times, it would serve as pig food, and in very lean times, it would serve as food for the poorest of the poor. But here is this picture, and again, the literary work is incredible, that he's doing the lowest job possible, and here he is longing to he longed, it's like he strongly desired to eat pig food. He's gone from living in luxury, spending the money freely, eating the best meals, to longing for pig food and not even getting to eat the pig food. That is, oh. And so it is when we chase the world and when we chase sin. We long for the luxuries, and in finding them, eventually we are brought to the lowest of low, and nothing satisfies. So it is with sin. Verse 17. And this is literally what it means. Sometimes they translate it coming to one's senses, which is a pretty good illustration. And coming to himself, he said, how many of my father's workers have more than enough bread? So the comparison between he doesn't get the pig slop, and he's thinking of people in his house. They have more than enough bread, and I am dying of hunger here. Coming to himself. As Calvin said, I think, it was maybe God's grace that he sent the famine that brought him so low, because here he remembered his father's house. In common parlance, he has hit rock bottom. And finally, at rock bottom, he comes to himself and remembers where he came from. And he says, even the workers, even the day laborers, which is his job here, at his father's house have more than enough bread. And so, in this time, he comes up with a plan. Hunger being, as Calvin says, the best teacher. I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. No longer spelling mistake. Am I worthy to be called your son? Make me as one of your hired men. And let's take note of this whole sentence here, because when he goes, he's not going to say this whole thing. We have to deal with that as a commentator. So his plan is he will get up and maybe like a rise. It's kind of a picture of he's in the rock bottom. And so he's going to get up out of rock bottom and go to his father. You can only speculate about the psychology here, but his pride, I think, led him to leave his father, to take his money, and ultimately led him to feeding pigs, and it wouldn't let him even consider going back until he had gone to the lowest place. And here he decides to renounce all claims of sonship. He says, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. He's not going to even claim to be a son. He's just going to be a hired man, to be a day laborer for his father. So verse 20, and arising, he went up to his father. And now the picture changes. So we have the son, and now it's going to be focused on the father's actions. And while he was far off, his father saw him. We see all of the different things. Saw him, 1, had compassion, 2, running, 3, fell on his neck, which is maybe it's a term for hugged him, and kissed him. We see all of these actions of the father driven first by compassion. And when he saw him, he had compassion. This compassion is compassion we often see as one of pity. Splagagnisomai. My pronunciation again. Splalagnisomai, which is, and we can look at this as another word that we can look at. Splalagnisomai is an aorist, past tense, to be moved as to one's bowels, hence to be moved with compassion. And they thought the bowels, like your stomach, were the seat of love and pity. And the knot you get in your stomach, and that's kind of the thing. And we see this in the New Testament, showing compassion. We see it other than this case, this word's used for Jesus. Matthew 9:36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion. He was moved with pity. And here, this same movement of pity is with the Father when he sees his Son. And he had compassion, and then he ran. And to run, you would have to, in robes, and you'd have to like pull them up between your legs and tie them around to run in a robe. And it was not the most dignified thing for him to do, but he throws off all dignity because he's moved so much by emotion to run to his Son. Running, he fell on his neck. He hugged him closely and he kissed him. And the kiss here is like the kiss of a close, intimate friend or family member. And in this kiss, he treats him exactly as a son, not as a reckless vagabond. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Now, he stops here, and as I said, his plan was to say, make me one of your hired servants. And I think that at this point, most commentators agree that when he's in the middle of his speech, as his father is, hugging and kissing him, his father doesn't even say a word to him, but instead, as he gets halfway through his speech, his father interrupts, speaking not to him, but to the servants. And the father said to his servants, quickly bring out the best robe and clothe him. So in this, we can see the desperateness of his plight, that he had no sandals for his feet. He had, maybe just rags that he was coming back with. He left with a third of the property and came back with rags. And so the father clothes him. And if you want to, be a little allegorical and talk about how God accepts us and clothes us with Christ's righteousness, maybe that wouldn't be too far off. And he gave him a ring on his hand, and this ring certainly is going to symbolize him being part of the family. And so when he says, I am not worthy to be called your son, he puts the ring on his finger so that his sonship would be known to all. And sandals for his feet. Perhaps he had another family ring that he hawked at some point for another drink. And here the father replaces it without thought or cost. Yeah, it's an incredible picture of grace. I think about, I'm an oldest brother, and I think about my younger brother wasted the family fortune, my attitudes, but God's grace is so extravagant here. And it goes on, and bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and rejoice, for the son of mine was dead and now lives. What was lost has been found, and they begin to celebrate. It says dead here. And this is really, as he had left the Father's house, he was really dead, in a picture of our own deadness apart from Christ. So now they bring the fatted calf and they kill it. It says, verse 23, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and rejoice. For the son of mine was dead, now lives. What was lost has been found. And they began to celebrate. The fatted calf was an animal specifically fed for a feast day. It may have been set aside for the Day of Atonement or another day. And if it is the Day of Atonement, that's a day where this calf would be sacrificed for the forgiveness of sins, ultimately pointing to Jesus Christ. Now, perhaps it's too much of a stretch to say that the feasting of the calf and the sacrificing of the calf is directly pointing to the Jesus Christ. But I wouldn't completely discount it either, for all blood sacrifices ultimately point to Jesus Christ. Now, in the text, the emphasis isn't on sacrifice, but on feasting, on Thanksgiving. And we see just the joy of this occasion. Meat is rarely eaten. And so this is an equivalent of a party that pulls out all the stops. And it's hard to compare to anything today because generally we eat meat, whenever we fancy it. So we've had the younger son then. We've had the father and his grace. And now we're going to turn to the older son, his older son. It's comparative. And his older son was in the field. And as he came near, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants, asking, "What is this?" And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, for he has received him safe and sound." And he was angry and did not want to go in, but his father came out to convince him. Verse 28. We want to remember the context here, going all the way back to Luke 15. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." The older son is a picture of the Pharisees and the scribes, and the party is a picture of the eschatological feast that Jesus has pointed to again and again. We remember Luke 14, where Jesus is talking about a man who gave a banquet and invited so many, but they all made excuses and wouldn't come in. And here we see the older son, representing the Pharisees, who will not go into the party, representing God's eschatological kingdom. And the younger son represents the Pharisees and tax collectors, and which can easily extend to Gentiles and anyone who's gone astray from God. Jesus is telling this parable to defend his mission to repentant sinners and tax collectors, and eventually to the Gentiles. Now, we see the beauty of grace as the father who runs to the prodigal, but we also see the danger of the older son, a danger that here is directly to the Pharisees and scribes, but also can extend to anyone in the church who is rejecting God's grace and not seeing it. So let's look at this closely, because his answer is important. And answering, he said to his father, "See here, how many years I have served you, and not one of your commandments I have passed by or neglected. And for me, you did not give a goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who devours your property with prostitutes, comes, you kill the fatted calf." The language is key here, and we want to see served you first. And in serving you, this is a word, douleo, from doulos, talking about a service, or even douleo, properly to be a slave, to serve, to do service. And the idea of service here, it's a stronger word than being a laborer. And so he's looking at, I have done all of these things. And he thinks his relationship, the older brother thinks his relationship with the father is one of service. He does this and then deserves give, and give is a broad word, could mean a lot of things, but one of the meanings of give is to give payment for. And so I have worked so hard, I have slaved away for you, I have followed every one of your commands. And this is, almost pulling back the curtain of the illustration of the parable and making it directly about the Pharisees fulfilling the commands of the Mosaic law. And they have not gotten payment. So his mistake is that the older brother sees his relationship with the father as one of service. He works and the father rewards. And now when the younger son comes back, who has done everything possible to deserve condemnation, comes and the father shows his grace, he says, this isn't fair. He hasn't done the work that I have done. His pride in his own works will not let him accept the Father's grace for the Son, or even the Father's grace for himself. He says, this son of yours, denying his brother, devours property, prostitutes, probably true, kills the fatted calf. He, ironically, is complaining of his younger brother's actions while he is deeply disrespecting the father. When he says, you killed the fatted calf for him, he's saying, you are a fool, father. You do not know what you are doing in showing this grace to this person who has not worked for it like I have. In this deep disrespect, the father is still offering his kindness. Verse 31. And he said, child, always you are with me. All my things are yours. It is right to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and now lives, and was lost and is found. All my things are yours. Now, that is literally true. He has divided the inheritance, and the rest of the estate is his. But in this picture here, the father is saying, you misunderstand our relationship. This isn't you do the work and you get trinkets of a goat. Why are you talking about a goat when you have everything by grace, if you will have it? If you will come to me as a father who is merciful instead of a slave owner who doles out trinkets for good work. We see in this text there's something deeply wrong with the older son's vision of the father, because he does not see the father as the father of grace. The father says, always you are with me. You are a member and you can have these by grace. Now he says it's right to celebrate, and it is. For what was dead lives. They celebrate a resurrection, and what is lost is found. And this brings us back to the Pharisees again and the three parables, because what was lost is found in the sheep. The lost sheep is found, and Jesus is calling the friends to celebrate. The coin is found. The woman calls her friends to celebrate. And now the son is found, and the father is calling the older brother to celebrate. The parable ends abruptly, but it is desperately sad in that the Pharisees are standing outside the party, refusing, and the only thing that separates them is their pride, refusing to come in to a party where repentant sinners are invited. This is a text that deeply shows God's amazing grace and our own resistance from it, especially from religious people. I pray that you will be able to study it and see God's beautiful grace.